Thank you for downloading this RealAgriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Shaun Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147 at Sirius XM. Well, last week, one of the big news-making items was the fact that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did an interview. Well, he didn't do it with Real Ag Radio. We'll hold that against him. But he did do it with a friend of mine, Ryan Jespersen. And his show is Real Talk Ryan Jespersen. And Ryan joins us right now to break down what he learned from the interview, what he heard, and maybe what people didn't hear. Ryan, how's it going?
Hey, man, it's awesome to be on the show, Shaun. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, congratulations. Independent media really forging a path. You had a lot of success with the show. And for the second time, is that correct? You've interviewed the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, this is my fourth interview with him, but this is the second one on Real Talk. So,
wow.
One on TV back in the day when he had just won the Liberal leadership, wasn't Prime Minister yet. And then once on my terrestrial radio show when he had just beat Stephen Harper. And then a couple of times in the last few years on Real Talk. Yeah, so it's been good. Every interview's had a bit of a different theme. The last one was on April 20th of 2021. It was 420. So we talked about my favorite crop, Shaun, which is cannabis, and we got into that. But there was no pot talk on this most recent one.
Okay, so what's your takeaway? A lot of people have been writing about the interview. They've been talking about it. Some people highly critical of some of the things that he said. What you were on the other side of the mic. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I mean, obviously it's an interview that's gleaned a lot of attention, and because it was an exclusive, it was the only media appearance that he did on that trip to Western Canada, announcing a bunch of money, like almost cumulatively $2 billion for housing investment the federal government's making to try to get a hold on, try to get a handle on this housing crisis. So he was in BC dumping a bunch of cash there, and then he came into Alberta, stopped off with us and then did a couple of appearances, obviously some funding announcements, and then moved on. So we were the only ones to have him on the record, and he went, man, 35 minutes in studio with us and talked about a whole bunch of stuff. So obviously the national media dug into it, and it was, leading the headlines on CBC, The National, and The National Post. The Globe and Mail wrote about it, obviously Post media papers and a lot of political bloggers. So, I mean, hell, Alex Jones wrote about it on InfoWars.
Oh, now you've made it. Now you've made it.
Now you've made it.
Yeah.
Obviously it was interesting to see. I'm not surprised that it got a lot of people's attention.
Yep.
The Prime Minister really did shoot from the hip. You don't have to like him or, be a supporter of the Trudeau Liberals to acknowledge that he came in, he took fastball questions and shared some real thoughts. I mean, some of the stuff, if you're not a big fan of his, you might listen and describe them as non-answers or BS. Some people didn't like what he had to say about certain things. That's fine. But he did sit and take the questions. He did make himself available. He did it without notes, without a script, without seeing the questions ahead of time, which I always think is worth mentioning. And so I'll give him credit for that.
Didn't meet with Premier Daniel Smith.
He did not.
That definitely got some headlines as well.
Yeah, and I mean, depending on who you believe, the premier basically says that she was unaware he was coming to the province. That's obviously not true. She was aware, but whether or not she wanted to make herself available to him or he wanted to make himself available to her is a whole different matter. Kind of interesting to see him make these housing announcements in Calgary and Edmonton with municipal representatives. In particular, I'll speak to Edmonton with Amarjeet Sohi, who is, of course, his former infrastructure minister, and Randy Boissonnault, who's the Edmonton Centre MP, the jobs minister. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the FCM, has been calling on the federal government to make more of these announcements with Ottawa dealing directly with municipalities. And I did ask him about that, if that's, the reason for that. We did point out in the interview that the province was not represented. He spoke to us before the announcement, So he didn't want to scoop his own details, so he didn't get into a lot of the specifics. But I think it shows a couple of things. On one hand, it may be a non-issue, but optically, I think that it does reiterate the fact that there's no love lost between Danielle Smith's Conservatives and Justin Trudeau's Liberals. If it was a big love-in, though, Shaun, how do you think that would play? I mean, if all of a sudden the Western Conservative premiers like Smith and Moe started getting along really well with the Prime Minister, they lose their ammunition. It's not going to happen.
Well, right? And it's very good politics for the provinces to campaign against the feds and for 100%. The feds to campaign against the provinces. Like it's that's from an old playbook. And there's still
and he really did. He didn't hold back his fire on Danielle Smith's government. People can check out my full interview, obviously, wherever they get their podcasts or on YouTube. And he basically said that he thinks that right-wing ideology and the right-wing ideology of Danielle Smith's government, that's his quote, is standing in the way of progress in Alberta. And ultimately, he went on the record to say that he thinks that the Danielle Smith government is fooling Albertans and that oil sands companies are fooling their workers. He said famously, probably in my mind, the biggest quote that he gave us.
Absolutely.
You know, Shaun, you're doing an interview and someone says something and you just get that shot. As the interviewer, you get that shot of adrenaline where you go, that's the quote. So he said to me, basically, he says, the provincial government needs to get out of its own way. He was critical of the, moratorium that the Smith government had imposed on new wind and solar developments in the province of Alberta. The moratorium that's set to end, as a matter of fact, coming up right, as we're talking, basically. He said that he thinks that the ideology of that government is standing in the way of preparing Alberta's skilled labor force for jobs of the future. And I do think that there is room for some conversation on that. But when I jumped in, I interjected, even though a lot of the critics on Twitter, Shaun, are claiming that I didn't push back on anything and that I never took issue with anything the Prime Minister said. If you actually watch or listen to the interview, you'll see that, of course, I did. And I said, hang on a second, Mr. Prime Minister. I said, I can hear the Premier right now. I can hear the oil sands CEOs right now saying, did Justin Trudeau just say that government needs to get out of the way of innovation in the oil sands? And he says, yes, that is what I said. And I said, well, let me tell you something. They think that you're the problem. I said, they think that you're the one that doesn't have Alberta's back. And as soon as I said that, you can see his posture changes in the chair. And he says, I don't think that oil sands companies have oil sands workers' backs. And I went, oh, wow. And it kind of took off from there.
That was the quote that everyone was like, what is he talking? Like, whoa, where, like,
yeah.
Where did that come from? And the other part I think that a lot of people have trouble with on the right side of the aisle with this is like they're being fooled by prosperity. What exactly are they being fooled with?
Yeah, I mean, like nobody's complaining about the prosperity. That's for sure. I think that his, the premise of his comment. Obviously, let's be clear. I feel like in this day and age, I almost have to clarify and specify things, whereas maybe before we didn't have to. But when I'm giving you this insight on what I think he meant by that, or what I think he was talking about, this is not me carrying water for the Prime Minister. This is not me endorsing his message. But basically, he went on to say that by failing to invest in the long-term future of health in Alberta's energy industry. In other words, by continuing to go to the well, by believing, and I personally, Ryan Jespersen, do believe that there are still decades of demand for Alberta crude and for traditional oil and gas. But I do think, and Stephen Harper believes, that at some point a transition is inevitable. And I think anybody's fooling themselves if they don't believe that. And I think that Trudeau basically said, and he spells it out in the interview, he says, by continuing to chase profits today at the expense of preparing for the future, the oil industry doesn't have the backs of its workers. That was kind of the premise of what he was saying.
Did he say anything about agriculture at all?
I mean, no, and that's probably kind of my fault too, in the sense that like you just got to kind of pick and choose what you're going to talk about, but we didn't get into ag a whole lot, to be honest with you. I do want to say that, like, I'm going to be talking to this. I don't know if you know Kevin Krausert. So he's one of the finalists. He's a big oil sands innovator. He's like an energy innovator. He's going to be joining me on the show. Obviously, like, you don't just sort of take the PM's word on stuff and move on. If anything, this interview has given us fodder
Yeah.
for like weeks more of interviews. And so Kevin Krauser is going to be, he supports companies that are finalists in, Elon Musk's X Prize for direct air capture. And so he's going to be, the premier spoke at his event a couple of days after we spoke with the prime minister, and he's going to be joining me on the show. So, well, obviously we're going to get a whole bunch of different takes. Like, I'm not going to have, like, Pathways Alliance advertises on my show, right? Like carbon capture, oil sands, taking environmental action, or at least climate action, like, if you want to call it that, recognizing and acknowledging that there is public demand and public appetite for sustained prosperity in the oil sands. And so, I'm looking forward to hearing nobody wants to know what my opinion is on this. I think that we need to hear from expert voices, including the Albertans and the Canadians that work in the oil sands, that care deeply about the environment, and probably also, you can say, care deeply about the long-term health of their industry. So lots to talk about.
Now, I know you led with addressing the fact that he getting crushed in the polls. Like, it's a 17-point difference now, according to Abacus data.
Walloped. 17 is like the nicest one I've seen.
Yeah. So what did he say about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was question number one. I used a word on purpose. I really script out my questions. I like to kind of run and gun and just, chat conversationally how people talk. But I felt like I needed to script question one. And I just basically said to him, pollsters are predicting an absolute bloodbath for your government in the next election. Where's your head at? And he says, my head's at continuing to do the work Canadians voted us in to do. And he sort of, whether you believe him or not, said that he doesn't really care what the polls have to say a year and a half out from election. He didn't give us that time marker, by the way. He didn't, but we're assuming that the election will probably be fall of 2025. But yeah, he basically said, listen, he said that they counted me out in the polls in 2015. He said they counted me out in the polls in 2019, 2021. But I would say now this is me talking. Yep. It feels like it's different this time around. Number one, I'll give Pierre Poilievre credit for that. There's a different feel, isn't there? There's a different vibe with the energy and the fundraising and the membership sales around this Poilievre leadership with the Conservatives. And, I talked to Charles Adler once a week. Adler's not convinced. We kind of argued last week.
He does not like Poilievre at all.
Yeah, but he's, Adler's interesting, right? Because he has personal feelings about people, and then he has his professional feelings.
Okay.
I was just chatting with him. I don't know when your audience is going to hear this, but my most recent conversation with Adler, he talked about how much he likes Danielle Smith, but then he talked about the political persona that she plays. And some of the influences on her, and that's what he's taking issue with. But I will say this, to get to Adler's point, he figures that the Conservatives would be polling just as well with Erin O'Toole as their leader. And that's where I push back. I don't believe that. I don't, because you're kind of almost suggesting that it's like undeserved momentum, that the momentum has nothing to do with the Conservatives, that it has everything to do with people being critical of the Liberals. And there may be an element of truth to that, but I don't believe Pierre Poilievre is wired completely differently than Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole. Way different. Yep. And that's why I think that this polling, I'm taking it a little bit more seriously.
It changed in the summer. What also changed was the haircut and the glasses. But I don't think that's a factor. What changed is one word: affordability. Mm-hmm. As soon as they pivoted to focus on affordability, that's what cut them the swath, and people started to identify with it. And that's one of the reasons why they're having a hard time right now with the branding of the carbon tax is because of that affordability piece. People can't understand what the heck's going on. I pay a tax and I get a check back. I don't understand this.
It's interesting. I talked to the Prime Minister about that, again, another softball, Shaun, that I lobbed him was me saying that you have completely lost public confidence in your carbon tax. Another softball. But he went on to say what he said before, which was that, he says he says in Alberta, as an example, the average family is going to get this much, which is more than they pay in. And I said, but listen, that's been the message the whole time. Yeah. And whether or not that's true, people have basically lost confidence in it as a tool for Canada's climate action. So what's your plan there? Now, on the Poilievre side of things, brilliant. To talk about affordability, because it's there on a silver platter. It's there on a tin platter, let's say. Yeah. Let's reflect where it's on a tin platter. But But at some point, Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives are going to have to say, like, here's our plan, right? And that comes in the form of an election platform. They're not compelled to give it yet. So I would.
There's a lot of time. I think
a lot of time.
You're playing. I've been telling audience I've been speaking to on the show and in conferences, there is a long time between now and the fall of 25. And a big part of their gamble here is if you're a liberal strategist, a big part of your gamble is waiting for the Conservatives to potentially knock themselves off their own pedestal, shoot themselves in the foot. Right?
Yeah. And another, yes, 100%. I agree with you. Let him keep going, right? And there's been some interesting developments there as well. I don't know how into the weeds you want to get, but this Take Back Alberta founder, David Parker, throwing absolute Molotov cocktails at Pierre Poilievre over the weekend. Oh my gosh. Like that's kind of wild. But I would say with Trudeau, another probably the sleeper answer that he gave us that I'm surprised more people aren't talking about is that he all but confirmed for the first time, as far as I can tell, in our interview on February 21st, that he's running again. That he is. I said, like, are you 100% sure? I said some people are calling for like a total brand reinvention of this party, and with the party polling so poorly. And let's take a look at like the Prime Minister's personal approval rating right now. You're referencing that Abacus data poll from David Coletto a while back. Minus 33 is no bueno. If you're a minus 33, this is not a golf score. You're not happy with 33 under. And I said, for the people that are basically calling for a leadership change, are you 100% convinced that it's going to be you leading this party into the next election? And he basically said, yeah. So
how similar are him and Joe Biden right now? Clearly an age difference, different reasons, but it's the same exact conversation that is happening. Is the best thing if you were a supporter of that party, the best strategy would be for you to step aside and give us a chance. It's similar.
Although nobody thinks that Justin Trudeau is going to fall down a flight of stairs or die in his sleep. Like Joe Biden, and hey, like I'm the furthest thing from a Trump supporter, but like, give me a break. You cannot convince me that in a nation of nearly 400 million people, these are the two best candidates they could find.
But I think it speaks to the fact that it's really, when you are in that role, it's different than other roles. It is like the role, and it is incredibly difficult to walk away. Even when you know you are marching to your own political demise, it's really difficult to leave.
I can't believe I'm saying this as a Western Canadian to a Western Canadian, but it would almost be like resigning as the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's the most profitable, highest spending, easiest team to manage in the entire National Hockey League. I hope the Leafs lose every game they ever play. Don't get me wrong, but I think that it's one of those things. And you're never going to have a job. I mean, you're the president of the United States, the Prime Minister of Canada. Like you just said, Shaun, you'll never have another job that'll even come close to that. I don't care how much they're paying you on the lecture circuit. I don't care what boards you sit on. I don't care whose private jets you fly on. You'll never be the Prime Minister again. So I understand it'd be tough to let go of. As a person with a very healthy ego, I think it'd be very difficult as well to step aside. But like, does Justin Trudeau honestly want to roll in like, Kim Campbell post Brian Mulroney kind of thing, like take his party down to, you remember that thing? You remember that the oldest joke in the book? Which I think it was like, what does Kim Campbell have in common with a Mazda Miata? Two seats. Like, no, Justin Trudeau doesn't want to lose 90 seats. He doesn't want to lose 100 seats in the next election.
That's how he's polling.
Yeah. Now, like you said, though, man, all it takes is like an unflattering story coming out around Pierre Poilievre or something, like whatever. There's tons of time, but still, the Liberals have a ton of work to do.
Yeah. Okay. So we all have question regret as interviewers. We all face this where it's like, oh, you're going to show us that question. Yeah. Is there a question you wish you would have asked him in retrospect?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, when you say, did you ask him about ag? I mean, I come from a family of proud farmers. As you know, Shaun, I don't even know how to drive a tractor. But that doesn't mean I don't respect the hell out of the industry. So I would have loved to ask him about ag. We didn't get around to talking about the ArriveCan app, which is to me, like, I don't know how something goes from 80,000 to $60 million in budget. That to me is like just there's a bigger story there that has more to do with like government procurement, the public service, checks and balances, competence. But that's something we could have got into that we didn't. And to be honest, I mean, I was joking about cannabis earlier, and this may seem like a niche thing, but it's not. If you look at revenue projections on what provinces could do with cannabis and what they are doing, and then if you also look at like retail, NDLPs, licensed producers, at how many insolvencies and bankruptcies there are.
It's a death march. It's crazy.
It's a death march, man. And it's like this. He's the prime minister that legalized it. And my personal feeling, I'll always give him credit for that. But they're not doing it well. And part of that is the provinces. Part of that is the feds. There's been virtually no crackdown on the so-called gray market. We're calling it gray. It's not gray. It's illegal. But a lot of people are still using that market. And the tax burden on producers is crazy. And had I had more time, I would have asked him about that. But ArriveCan was ahead of cannabis in the queue, so we didn't get to either of them.
Yeah, but that speaks to, again, where like that's both sides of the aisle do this, where they make an announcement, they're great piece of legislation that a lot of people are in support of, and it's like, okay, we did it, we're good.
Yeah.
And forgetting about the actual implementation and structuring, that's been a wreck.
Well, and it's
there's been a lot of equity lost.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that like emotion or anecdotes should drive or dictate government action, but like if you look, and again, if you'll permit me to paint in really broad brush strokes, like you look at the people that made hundreds of millions of dollars when cannabis was legalized. They were all the opportunists that came in early and basically sold their shares, they sold their stock before it was even legal. Like there was all this hype, there was this green rush, as they call it, and these people made out like bandits with really no vested interest in it. And then you look at the people that are like losing their shirts right now. It's the people that are trying to work to keep the industry afloat, the legal industry afloat. And it drives me crazy.
Well, hey, Ryan, great stuff. Really appreciate you. We got to do this more often.
I would come on anytime, and we got to get you on Real Talk as well.
Yeah, I would love to do that for sure. That is Real Talk. Ryan Jespersen. Hey, Ryan, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Shaun.